Sean Haney from RealAgriculture here with Jim Wiesemeyer. He is DC policy analyst with Pro Farmer. Jim, it's great to chat with you again.
Always good to be on your program.
Yeah, Jim, lots happening. It's been about 3 weeks since we last chatted. In that time period, we had a really important visit from China's President Xi, visiting with President Biden of the U.S., of course. What's been kind of the reaction after that meeting?
Well, the general reaction, and I don't agree with it, by the way. I think the typical reaction from most journalists typically is on the negative side. Even when low expectations were fulfilled, admittedly, I think the reason why I differ in that is, number one, they did talk. Number two, I think the talks went better than expected because they laid some ground for future talks. The takeaways from the meeting is that renewed military to military conversations, a commitment by both Xi Jinping, the leader of China, and our President Joe Biden to pick up the phone and talk if they have any individual issues. That's always good when at least you could have the ability to talk. And then the one that the general press is poo-pooing is the commitment by China to do some more enforcement on the fentanyl, on the ingredients used to make fentanyl. Primarily, it's hesitant because they gave former President Trump a similar commitment and they didn't follow through. So I understand that. But again, Xi Jinping met privately with a group of big U.S. company CEOs, and that told me that he wants to open up China again to U.S. and Western investment because, we wrote in Pro Farmer that China is always accommodating when they want to be. And in this case, they had no choice. Their economy is a little iffy right now. Yeah. Their real estate crisis is worse than our banking crisis in the U.S. was several years ago, Sean. So bottom line, although we're not back to the prior U.S.-China cordial relationships before Trump, at least the downside has been stopped. So it looks like up from here. Okay.
Yeah. Well, I was going to ask, what was the expectation? I'm always interested in what the take is in the Post and what people say, and interesting, your contrarian thoughts to what a lot of the mainstream media has reported. What were they, besides the fentanyl, what were they actually expecting to happen? Hey,
not much.
Biden, yeah. Okay.
Not much. And I don't know what they would have called a successful summit. See, to me, when you even meet, because you'll recall that the last time a high-level summit at one time, not between Biden and Xi, but between the State Department secretaries, if you will, that was canceled because of the balloon incident. So
who could forget the balloon?
Yeah, I think the general press wanted more on sensitive Chinese issues. They wanted more on Taiwan. They wanted more on human rights and things like that. Well, you can do that privately, but you don't announce that of what you talked about in detail because of the sensitivity in China. So I think it was unrealistic expectations on the general press corps. So we'll see if this continues. Now, it's very shaky because, again, we wrote in Pro Farmer that this is still on a hair trigger as far as U.S.-China relations. Things can blow up awfully fast.
Oh, yeah, she's a roller coaster. And yes. I guess the one thing that I thought about was the fact that with all the instability that is happening right now in the world, we just got to look at what Israel, we have to look at Ukraine. I think it's okay to have some discussions that seem kind of neutral and relatively normal from a diplomacy standpoint. I guess it's a little bit comforting. Now, sticking with Asia, we did see this week, I saw in your Pro Farmer morning newsletter, Reuters was reporting that former President Trump is talking about, if reelected, pulling the U.S. out of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. That's that 13-country deal. He called it TPP 2.0. Yeah. Why, Jim? In Canada, there is nothing but strong encouragement they feel that the U.S. is way ahead of Canada and Canada's playing catch up when it comes to Indo-Pacific relations and trade. Is this just more of the same kind of anti-trade rhetoric, or what's driving this?
Well, it's kind of anti-trade rhetoric that was traditional trade a policy. And also, if Biden was pushing it to whatever degree, Trump will be against it, and vice versa. I mean, that's the era we're in right now. If one party proposes one thing, then the other party is against it, which is silly. I'll tell you, I just recently came from a series of speeches throughout ag country, and the farm groups and a lot of farmers are concerned about, while they may like Trump's overall policy, he could be much different in a Trump 2.0 administration, especially when it comes to trade, because he has said, as only Trump can, how Trump can say it, his first week in his second term would be a 10%, at least a 10% across the board tariff on all imports. Well, he doesn't think countries will retaliate. And U.S. agriculture relies a lot on exports. And we already have now consecutive years of record ag trade deficits. That is bellowing out to officials, or should be, and in Congress, that you need to change your trade policy to get more access for U.S. agriculture. And that's not where we're at, either in the Biden administration or in any second Trump administration. So there is a lot of concern, and it's realistic.
Yeah, that seems to be the opinion that is really stuck to Catherine Tai, the USTR, and President Biden, is that there has not been a lot of focus from the U.S. perspective on finding new market access for U.S. products, which I've said to you before is so ironic, because in Canada it's more like, hey, we have all these deals, why don't we ever enforce them, which seems to be more of what Tai is trying to do. So yeah, it's interesting, the different perspectives. But Catherine Tai was supposed to be a little bit more like Robert Lighthizer, just maybe a softer version, and there has been a little bit of a different tact from her perspective, hasn't there?
Yeah, for Tai, she tells farm groups, she says, hey, we hear you. We hear you on the market access, but the prior approach just did not work for other sectors in the U.S. economy. Right. So we're going to focus on that as opposed to agriculture. Now, what Tai doesn't want to say is that she wanted to progress on that Indo area agreement, but she was pulled back by the White House because of the progressives in the so-called progressives in Congress, and so even her wings were clipped on that one, to show you bottom line, Sean, I hate to say it, but both parties to me are turning isolationist.
Right.
And that's not a good sign. It's just they just don't want to talk about trade. I've got my daily report, as you well know, and there's a trade policy section within that. Many days, there's nothing to report. That tells me something right there. There's just not much activity going on.
Well, it seems what's happened is what sort of overrules everything is on trade is telling people what they want to hear. And right now there is a sentiment in the countryside and in cities that, hey, the U.S. is being taken advantage of it and that kind of stuff. And so it's easy to say, like, hey, we need to shut this down. It is concerning from a both party perspective. It's easy to pick on former President Trump, and because he's a little bit more bombastic about it. But hey, the Biden administration has not exactly been a friendly trade partner in some respects as well. There's growing concern in Canada, already thinking ahead. And this is kind of when you and I first started doing a lot of work together, was going back to 2016 when the renegotiation of the NAFTA agreement began. Remember, we've got a renegotiation coming up. It was written into that agreement. I think it's 2026. And I'm hearing from farm groups a lot of concern. Biden or Trump or whoever, there is concern about what that renegotiation really looks like, Jim.
Yeah, and I agree. That concern is well founded. Now we need to know the players, of course, because they still will vary. But if it's Trump, he will want to extract something to call it his agreement. That's just again Trump 101. So yeah, I think we've got some hurdles to cross. And I didn't mention that another signal that we need to boost. Trade policy here in the U.S. for agriculture is corn exports. It looks like for the second consecutive year, Brazil will export the most of any country of corn. That was unheard of, for decades. And again, it's another indication from a jobs perspective. Export-oriented jobs usually pay more
Yeah.
in the processing of materials, in the throughput, and things like that. And in many cases, it's the difference between profit or loss of an industry, the margin, especially in the meat side,
Yeah.
because that could be your difference between profit or loss for many yeah, meat producers. So if you start signaling you're going inward again, that's not a good sign, and I think your carryover for commodities will start building higher.
Well, and look at what's happening in the auto sector, right? Heavy subsidization of EVs. There's slowing demand domestically. There's a glut of inventory, and so exports are huge, especially into Europe. So for the auto industry, those auto exports are really providing some relief. It's kind of uncomfortable when you have that kind of level of subsidization, though.
Yeah, here I'll tell you a personal story. Again, with all my speeches in farm country, a corn producer typically will ask me, Jim, you talk about your love affair with electric vehicles, which I do, because that's where all the best technology's going, the design. So, and I live in a suburban area, so I thought my next car was going to be an EV. But a month ago when I bought, I looked at the infrastructure and it still wasn't there to satisfy me. And also, a corn producer came up to me and asked, what do you like about EVs? And I said, number one, the power.
Mm.
Okay. Number two, the quietness inside the car because I'm hard of hearing. And, three, the design. And the corn producer said, there are cars available. Go out there and find one. So I did my search and I actually found a gas powered car to fulfill those requirements, gas powered. And it was a Genesis EV70. And I'm telling you, I'm just pleasantly surprised on all those levels. And so,
Nice.
and that was me that in a suburban area, and I think the numbers are starting to show that Americans are still uneasy about battery chargers. Where are they at? Additional investment if you have to do it at the house, and all the hassle involved with that, and the time it takes to charge if outside. The cost differential is narrowing between
Mhm.
an EV and now the incentives, because you can tell they're really incentivizing EVs
Yep.
in the U.S. Because of the lack of sales then. So I think we're about 3 years away from going back, back up, if you will. And on the farm level, I never tell a farmer to buy an EV because of the dust. I don't know how many
Yeah.
producers I've talked to that got an EV that have to go in at least twice a year to have the undersides of their automobile cleaned up because it degrades the battery. Okay. And that cost about $300 each trip in. So there's $600 right there.
You talk about the quietness. I was walking to the gym this morning, Jim. I almost got run over by a Tesla because that thing was so quiet. I didn't hear it coming.
I'm telling you, I don't need my hearing aids when I go in an EV,
Yeah.
nor in my Genesis GV70. So there's the thing on that. But I'll tell you, the money. Here's a political angle that
Yeah.
I get on this. CEOs of companies ask me, "Hey, if Trump is president, what happens to these incentives for biofuels?" And other credits, which is a good question because that's a lot of concern is where they put future money. And I told them, I said, from a political standpoint, if they get rid of those tax incentives, that would be considered a tax increase. And the Republicans don't like increasing taxes. So I think not all of them, but most of the biofuel tax credits will continue, even under a Trump administration, because of that nature. Congress will be very leery about increasing taxes.
Well, and also, if we still have a lot of narrative at that time about affordability and the price of gas, even though the price of gas in the U.S. and in Canada has been declining, if we're still really focused on that from a mainstream perspective, it'll be hard to get rid of those incentives because that means more expensive fuel. So
that's true.
That's a political issue there indeed. Hey, Jim, to wrap up, we had an Argentinian election. Strong libertarian elected. From an agriculture perspective, when we look at Argentina as an exporter, what do we see changing? What are you hearing around DC?
Well, he's really called the Trump of Argentina. So there's a wild card right there. He has a lot of really out there ideas. Now, he wants to have dollarization for the Argentine currency, the peso. I mean, which is just dropped like a rock.
Yeah.
Long term, if he would be successful in moving to a dollar-based currency, that could level the inflation or make it more contained in the future. And that would be good probably for Argentinian exports. But we're talking long-term. They have a lot of challenges to make their move, this controversial move, successful. The Wall Street Journal this morning has a big article about that, by the way, of the hurdles involved in that. But Argentina's got a horrible history of their currency and how that's it negatively affected their U.S. ag sector, that they've had to take alternative investments. It's changed their marketing cycle, etc. But I wouldn't rule out some long-term positives if their new populist president, I think he takes effect December 10th, if he's successful. Another trade angle on Argentina is that they're supposed to there's some trade policies under review within Argentina, and he has different ideas on trade policy as well. So they're rushing in Argentina to get some of these approved before he takes office December the 10th. So that's my bottom line on Argentina.
Could we see them get rid of that soybean export tax that farmers face domestically?
We could absolutely, but you had mentioned before we went on the air that the tax credits, the carbon credits in Canada?
Yeah, so
exemption?
Bill C-234 is a bill they're trying to get passed in the Senate right now, which would exempt farmers from having to pay the carbon tax on things like grain drying and barn heating and things like that. Farmers are lacking some influence.
Yeah, even if they were to be exempt, it's the camel under the tent that in the future they could be put on, and that's the problem with the tax that we see here in the United States. It's like the value-added tax of why the U.S. has always been leery about a value-added tax. On the surface, there are arguments for it. But once you implement a value-added tax, you can always increase it and keep increasing it for more income, you see? So there's the problem with any tax. It just doesn't stay there. And farmers should be very leery about any carbon tax. Let the market determine the energy supplies and utilization, and it looks like the world doesn't want that right now. They don't trust the market. They don't want investments to be decided. They want to decide it. So we're in this area of heavy control of even very open market economies like the United States. So we're going through some challengers of change years here.
Yeah. Well, and although some states have a price on carbon, a carbon tax or a pollution tax, everybody calls it different things. It's the same thing at the end of the day.
It's a tax.
Yeah. Nationally, somehow the U.S. has, and I'm definitely in support of this, stayed away from a price on carbon because of the cost it is on people down the line, especially when you don't have an alternative. It's not like you can have a solar powered grain dryer. You need to buy propane, you need to buy natural gas, and in a year where there's a really wet harvest in the Corn Belt in any country, that's a real added cost. Upwards of I think like $30 to $50 an acre from a cost perspective to dry your corn. It's crazy when you don't have an alternative. So the U.S. You should be thankful, probably unaware of it a little bit, but thankful that the Democrats or the Republicans has not chased that in terms of doing it.
I agree. I did want to tell your listeners and viewers one thing that I really picked up in my recent speeches is the concern about solar panels in the United States on farms. I'm telling you, go to Ohio, southwestern Ohio, and it's one of the biggest issues there, where some farmers are being offered contracts, multiple year, 10-year or more contracts of $1,000 or more an acre.
Right.
So but then the sensitivity of that is the visibility. You have these solar cells all over the place. This is good solid ground being used for solar cells. There's compaction issues as they're putting in the solar cells. There's the commitment of how many years that it's taken some farmers to be paid because the project is not yet complete. That's going to be a growing issue here in the United States. Again, in North Carolina, I saw the same thing when I was in Missouri. They had a big issue there. It was not only foreign ownership of farmland, but the second one was solar cells, as panels, and 80% of the panels are made by China.
Well, I think it could even be more than 80%. But I think there's more to that discussion. Is what is the quality of the farmland that's going on? Are they doing things like, say, one of our colleagues at RealAgriculture, editor Lindsay Smith, they do solar grazing. They graze sheep underneath the panels. So like that's I think that's a very, very cool way to manage the ground. And there's like a little bit of there's kind of a hypocrisy here a little bit. Like I understand where everyone's coming from, for and against. So it's not okay for a farmer to put solar panels, like get a lot of money and put solar panels on his land. That's not okay, but it's entirely fine to sell out your land to a developer and put up a new Costco and pave it over for a parking lot. Like, I'm like, you know what I mean?
I hear you. Now, the alternative to that is that I hear the primary reason they've gone to sheep grazing, if you will, in some states, is to get the much lower agricultural tax assessment.
Oh.
On that ground. There's your angle on sheep. They're not just putting sheep underneath those panels for the good of their heart. They want to maintain the much lower, in most states, if not all, tax assessment rate. And that has farmers upset, say, because this is a industrial use getting a agricultural tax exemption in what they think is an end around. So I'm just saying, my headline in my story that I'm writing on is "Let the sunshine in?" ?
Great stuff. Well, as always, Jim, it's always great to chat with you. All the best to you. We'll definitely do one more of these before the Christmas break. Thanks so much, Jim.
Sure.
All the best to you and have a great week.
Anytime.